Hello, welcome to Live Your Own Way with me, Lucy Gleeson Interiors, chatting homes, life and inspiration with my very special guests. Hello there, I hope you're having a good week. It's been a little while since my last interview, but I'm back now for more interesting design chats, so do subscribe. I'm starting with award-winning theatre set designer Max Jones. I was lucky enough to see his brilliant design work recently for the play Ulster American, written by David Ireland, starring Woody Harrelson, Andy Serkis and Louisa Harland. And then I plucked up the courage to ask Max to let me interview him on Live Your Own Way about his large catalogue of work, including RSC, Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, the Old Vic, Shakespeare's Globe, and he was associate artist at Theatre Clyward for 7 years. Max has also designed sets for the Theatre Cocoon in Tokyo. Although I've got a theatre background myself, but I've worked more in TV, I've always wondered how a good set designer manages to encompass a whole stage play into effectively one design when there is so much to consider in often complex stories. It's just one of my questions for Max, who is really generous with his advice and design experience. Hello, Max. Welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here on the podcast today. I really appreciate you talking with me. How's it going?
It's good, thanks. Yeah. I'm good. I've had a busy run of it over the last few months, and I'm just taking a bit of time to catch up on sort of some life and studio and freelance admin.
I would love to start with your early life, if that's okay. Did you grow up in a theatrical background, or what was it that kicked off your eye for set design?
Well, I mean, no, I didn't actually. I'm not from a theatre background or an arts background, which has sort of been interesting. So I got into theatre, I think, predominantly through school. I was sort of lucky enough to go to a school that had a really strong theatre sort of studies facility. It had a theatre, and it had a very sort of passionate teacher, clearly supported and wanted to push kind of theatre in the school, and I think made every effort to kind of ensure that it was sort of, got funding and the resources and the facilities were there to kind of really support that. I really got sort of sucked in through theatre studies lessons in school, and then during sort of, I guess, GCSE and A levels, getting involved in school plays and the sort of extracurricular side of what the sort of drama theatre world can kind of offer as well.
It makes such a difference, doesn't it, having teachers like that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a real game changer, and I think, in the context of diminishing sort of arts kind of resources at schools and theatre as well, like it feels like those opportunities are few and far between, and I mean, especially if you're trying to sort of get people into the field that aren't necessarily going to kind of have that handed down to them through a sort of a parent or family association. I didn't even really go to the theatre that much as a kid. So it was really through school and just sort of being around it at school, and that I got into it. I did art at school as well, and was kind of into that. Was sort of into the performance stuff. I was in the choir, I think, and sort of played a few instruments for a little while. And so it was generally sort of lent to those sorts of performance-based kind of things. I didn't want to be a theatre designer specifically for a while. I didn't even really know it was a profession that existed. I thought I'd probably get into architecture, actually. Probably under GCSE, somebody a year above or 2 years above, I heard, was going to study theatre design at a college after leaving school, and it was the first time I'd ever even heard of it sort of really being like recognisably as a sort of a profession in its own right.
Well, it's a very specific degree, isn't it? Because there are various creative degrees you can do, like fine art or whatever, but with theatre set design, at the end of it, you're going to be a theatre set designer. It's not like you can sort of veer off, or maybe you can veer off and do other things.
You would certainly hope. I mean, that's what appealed. I mean, it's very vocational, and it is a very specific craft. So rather than a kind of foundation sort of thing to open up doors in other ways. Having made that decision, it was pretty much a one-track kind of mind to kind of do that thing, So I did an art foundation course, but that was more to sort of, I think I knew then already what I wanted to do. So it was more to just try and build a portfolio that was a bit more interesting, and just to put me in a better place for when I went to colleges for sort of interviews for degrees. And that was good as well, because I'd been at the same school for quite a long time. So it was nice to sort of spend a year somewhere else. It wasn't a gap year particularly, but it was just a change of scenery.
So you're obviously a creative person, but for design, would you say that you have to be practical as well? Are you a bit of both?
It does help. There's it's the two parts of the job. Obviously there's the concept and the sort of visual dramaturgy and, the sort of fine art side of it, and how you are wanting to sort of express yourself as an artist on stage. But then there's also the real practical and sort of technical delivery requirement, which is being the person that sort of turns the imaginary into reality, and there's a lot of skills and tools that you need to sort of know and understand a bit and sort of develop as you go along that help you facilitate both yours and the director's vision. I'll talk a little bit about that, I'm sure, but technical drawing and understanding of how things are built and how to articulate and communicate that with everyone. We deliver our designs sort of principally still through physical models in UK theatre. There's a big requirement for that in sort of model making as a skill to help communicate sort of your three-dimensional designs. I also design costumes. So in the UK, at least, less common elsewhere, actually, the designers, if you're credited as a designer, you're typically designing set and costume for a UK production. It's not all the time, but it has been a lot of the time over the last couple of decades, which was sort of an eye-opener for me because I probably think I was more interested in the set side. And then when I went to college, I discovered that actually it was a slightly more encompassing role, and certainly had to kind of develop an eye for sort of costuming as well, develop costume drawings and costume research. And again, sort of trying to articulate, what you're trying to achieve in terms of looks with a costume supervisor and a team of makers as well, So the job's quite broad, both creatively, technical delivery, and also then, I guess, sort of leadership / people management as well,
There's an awful lot to think about, isn't there? There must be a lot of research that you have to do for costumes as well as the design.
Yeah, loads. My sort of design process is very research driven initially. You'll read a script, whatever that. Well, if you're working on a play specifically, obviously you can do. There's lots of things you can do, whether on an opera or dance or a devised piece. But if it's in the context of a kind of a play, you'd read that first a couple of times, and then I would start by sort of doing probably two breakdowns. One is sort of a kind of general play breakdown, which kind of carves the piece up into sort of scenes and locations with a little bit of a synopsis, kind of a sort of shorthand synopsis for each scene. And then a list of, prop furniture requirements or any sort of interesting kind of notes that are present in the text that might have an influence on what, the design requires or what the sense of the atmosphere might be. Or, if on first reading, if I have any strength of feeling, I'll always kind of jot that down as soon as possible on the first read, because when you get to the fifth time reading it, you get far more familiar with it than an audience is ever going to probably be. So it's sort of, you're always kind of trying to sort of capture that first instinct a bit when I read something for the first time. And then I'll also do the same for costume as well. So you'll do a chart with all the characters in, or if you know who the cast are, you'll do all the cast, and they're possibly playing multiple roles potentially, and you do a sort of a spreadsheet which kind of plots all of those journeys. And again, you start to kind of fill in what they may or may not be wearing when. You sort of look at it logistically in the first instance, just in terms of numbers and where they feature in the production. Whether it be a period show, like all your historical reference. So, I've got a lot of books I've collected over the years. So I'll scan a lot of those, and I use Dropbox now to sort of create like quite a big image library for every production. And I'll sort of do that process like a research folder for every key location, every key sort of costume. That can be a mix of anything that catches my eye. It can be period specific, if the show's period, but it could be artists I'm interested in at the moment. If I'm sort of wanting to do something a bit more abstract. I mean, it can be anything. This is where, this is the sort of you as artist bit comes in. It's kind of whatever is appealing to you in this moment right now. What is the sort of story you want to tell?
And how does the design process begin for your projects? Is it different each time?
The process I've just described, I sort of do every time. So that it always starts like that. But once I've sort of got like a digital mood board or whatever of the piece, and I've got a sense of the world that I want it to feel and look like stylistically. I try and get into sort of 3D modeling fairly quickly. So with the support of a regular associate designer, Ruth Hall. So I'll tend to then probably do some sketches on just very simple sketches on a scrap of paper or in a notebook. And simultaneously to all of this, I've also sort of got the plans already laid out of the venue. So I'm at the same time kind of try and build a pretty good understanding of the sort of possibilities of the venue. There's three things that can kind of influence, I guess, a design specifically. One, of course, is the play. The other is, as I've said, sort of you as an artist and how your interpretation is going to differ from anyone else's. The other one is the venue, and I lean quite heavily into that. A lot of my work is quite venue specific or venue focused. I like to kind of find sort of bespoke solutions for spaces, that sometimes might even have a bit more of an installation or slightly immersive sort of quality to them where possible. That's not always possible, but one of the things that satisfies me is to ensure that piece of work feels very purposeful for that space that it's kind of inhabiting. So having the sort of plans open and running, and then at some point I sort of put all of that together and I just start doodling on top of a plan. Just make some shapes and then I'll send those over to usually Ruth, and she'll start modeling those up in scraps of card and foam board and stuff, and we'll start to sort of make, certainly for the set design, some kind of shapes, some sort of concept models. There's kind of three key stages, I guess, to sort of developing a set design for theatre. You've kind of got a concept, and there's points where you share these with the company, with a producer or an employer. So you'll have a sort of concept kind of stage, which is you working principally with the director to sort of develop the feel and the sort of tone of the piece, and you'll sort of negotiate what this production kind of requires, what the play requires, and any sort of early ideas you might have in terms of the sort of direction of the visuals. And then you might be required to share that with the company at some point, just to kind of give them a little steer. And then the next key one is called a white card sort of phase, and that's where you then develop the design further. And at that point, typically you would present a white card model, a physical 1 to 25 scale model. So we model in 1 to 25. That wouldn't need to be painted necessarily, although I do tend to colour mine a little bit as soon as I can. And also there'll be some rough drawings attached to that. And the purpose of that is to then give companies a much clearer idea now of where you're looking to head towards. Also, the process of like costing starts there. Companies will cost from that white card model. And also now, any sort of ecological sort of parameters that are being set by the venue as well in terms of reuse, reduced carbon footprints and all of that. So that sort of starts to happen at the white card stage. Once you kind of get an in principle approval to go, you start to work towards a final design. And at that point, we're making a fully painted, scaled up version, 1 to 25 version of the show, and we make those, we model those to a quite high level of detail. So you end up with a 1 to 25 doll's house, essentially, if it's a naturalistic interior, and it might have scale figures in it. It'll be fully painted up, and you will then share that with the cast on the first day, and you will then take that to the builders and the scenic artists, and they will copy from that physical artifact with that plus a combination of your technical drawings, and it becomes, alongside the play script itself, I guess, it's arguably the second most important artifact in the production process. It's what everyone else then sort of rallies around. Lighting designers, sound designers, the stage management, cast, everyone starts to use that model or images of that model as the anchor point with which the piece then starts to kind of move forward. Yeah.
And you mentioned Ruth earlier. Is she part of your design team?
Ruth is a freelance designer in her own right. We share a studio, but she also is a regular associate designer for me, an assistant designer. Our profession is entirely freelance, largely, 99% freelance. As a designer, you are given a small kind of budget towards design development. Out of that budget, you will, as required, employ assistants, usually on sort of day rates to support the model making process. Or they might support you with technical drawing, or they might support you with costume drawing. And that assistant design role can be enormously sort of integral to design process on bigger shows, certainly, but also doubles as a quite a good access route for emerging designers to kind of get into the profession.
One thing that I find so unique about your work, being a theatre set designer, it's very different from TV or film because obviously with that you're moving from location to location. So with your work, you're covering an entire story with one set usually. I mean, obviously, you can have scene changes. So how do you encompass everything into one design?
That's the magic, isn't it? I mean, I love all of that. That's sort of, I think, one of the headline appealing things about the job, and how both creatively and sort of, I guess, as a intellectual challenge, sort of figuring out all of those layers and fitting them all in. I'm always considering the production as a wide shot initially. I actually print it out and I usually hang it by the model in my studio. So at a glance, I can sort of see the entire show from start to finish. If it's a show with a handful of locations, you could offer full scene changes for each location. I mean that's sort of considered somewhat a bit traditional now, actually. But like you could try and sort of go for full scene breaks and do a change. What you don't want to do is slow the piece down, but you might give that a go, and then in a sense you're trying to figure out how you fit all of those different locations into this theatre. Your solution might be thinking about it, like a Rubik's Cube, basically. How does the thing behind the scenes sort of rotate or slide or lift or, rise up from the ground or fly, so that you can then get everything else out of the way and present the one that you're wanting the audience to see in any given moment. So the scene in view is sort of the tip of the iceberg of a lot of kind of complex sort of design decisions. If there's lots and lots and lots of different scenes with lots and lots of sort of clear, distinct, different locations, you're probably not going to be able to do every scene with high realism. So what you might then be instinctively looking for is something that feels a bit more like a more expressionist sort of gesture, like a holding frame for the production. So you might set it in like one location, like a holding environment that kind of really resonates to possibly some of the themes, the underlying themes of the play. Lighting plays a huge part. We collaborate very closely with lighting designers who will not only obviously support the set design, should it have any sort of integrated lighting effects as part of it, but they will then also be going on their own creative journey in terms of how they carve up that space with light scene by scene and how they light the performers within that space as well. So you can do a lot of scene changes with just lighting. It's a fully collaborative process, involving a lot of creatives.
There's a lot of trust involved, isn't there, and faith in who you're working with.
Yeah, there is, and there's also a lot of communication. I mean, there's conversations happening all the time, and email exchanges and texts. So you might not really get that much sort of face contact time, like in-person contact time. So there's a lot of trust for people's sort of professional ability and integrity. So when you are kind of together, you can kind of push on more efficiently. It's nice to be on a show that has a sort of a mixture of people you've worked with before and some that you haven't. So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. But you'll work with somebody different every single time, and every show is different in terms of content as well. So the variation's amazing.
And is there a favourite type of theatre that you enjoy working at, for instance, like in the round or outdoor, or which are more challenging?
I've got to say, I'm less bothered by tours. So partly because not because I'm not interested in the challenge or can't do it, is that I do enjoy responding to a space. I do like designing for spaces or theatres that have a sort of an their own identity. they're interesting architecturally, or there's something about them that isn't necessarily you're not going to see elsewhere, because you always then it just gives you a little something you can kind of lean into design wise.
It must be so satisfying when you're actually watching the production. It's started, and you know that you created that from scratch. That lovely feeling, like wow, I do. Does that happen every time?
Well, eventually, you hope. Sometimes you can feel a bit burnt by them as well. It's not a show that I've done that I'm not proud of in some way. It's just hard work and sort of stressful, and can feel very under resourced sometimes and quite chaotic sometimes. And yet you all come together and put this thing on every time, to a deadline, and it opens every first night, like by and large. And that's kind of always strikes me as a minor miracle, considering how sort of badly resourced the industry sort of feels sometimes.
So I'd like to talk about some of your productions. There are so many, obviously, so I thought I would just pick out, a few diverse ones. And it'd be really interesting to know about your associate artist work at Theatre Clwyd. You were there for 7 years. So how did that come about?
Yeah, so Theatre Clwyd is a theatre in a producing house in North Wales, and it's in a place called Mold, which is near Wrexham, so sort of northeast. So I trained at the Welsh College of Music and Drama in Cardiff, which is in South Wales, and I'm from Bristol originally. So I was at college, and in the last year of college, we were doing sort of some hypothetical production designs. I think actually we did actually put so our college was great because Welsh College of Music and Drama, because they have a couple of working theatres in there, and you put on shows. So, and it was one of the things that appealed to me when I sort of went there in the first place. So the third year actors will act in them, third year designers will design them, third year sort of stage management will stage manage them, and you put on, to a pretty high standard productions, and you learn through experiencing putting on actual productions, and that's sort of amazing. And what they tended to do was get visiting directors in. And my third year show was directed by a director called Tim Baker, and he was at that time associate director at Theatre Clwyd. His sort of remit within that building was sort of running the educational kind of young theatre for young people kind of outreach stuff. And he invited me to come and do a couple of shows with them, shows largely aimed at younger audiences and that maybe sort of toured schools, and shows in their studio. And that's kind of how I got my foot in the door there initially. I finally got an opportunity to do a main stage show there. So they have sort of three spaces. They have a space that they tended to use for their youth theatre. And then they've got a really excellent studio space, like a multifunctional space you can kind of do all sorts of configurations in. And then they've got their main stage pros venue, which is called the Anthony Hopkins Theatre. And they were doing a production of The Grapes of Wrath. And that was my first show there on the main stage. So that was a big deal for me, because that was very much like, that was a large scale sort of main house production then, and was a big sort of a professional step up scale wise for me. It was important that I sort of nailed it, So, and even today, it's still one of the productions I'm sort of most proud of looking back. So that was fantastic. The artistic director at that point sort of finally, I think, started to take a bit of notice of my presence in the building, and he really liked that show and was very complimentary. He was a director called Terry Hands. He was a very well-renowned and well-respected Shakespeare specialist and former artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company. And he'd been with the RSC for many years, and eventually ended up at Theatre Clwyd running that building for about 15 years. And I did shows there then, for a number of years on and off, as one of a number of freelance artists there. And Terry continued to be sort of very supportive of my work. He paired me up with a director called Philip Breen, who was also a sort of an assistant to him at the time, around that time. And he suggested we get together, and he put us on our first show together. He and I have done maybe 20 productions together now. And, we're sort of each other's longer standing sort of artistic collaboration, I think. The two of us sort of young associates, young sort of designer director, being kind of partnered up by Terry Hands at Theatre Clwyd, and we've continued to work together since.
And I've seen some fantastic, amazingly impressive images of York Mystery Plays at York Minster, which you did a few years back, which looked, it was just immense, and the sheer scale of it. How did that come about?
Well, that's with Phil. He was approached. I'm not quite sure how it sort of started, but I mean, generally the approach will come to the director. So, in terms of how a piece of work is sort of initiated, it's generally sort of directors that are sort of in the hustle for work, or at least directors that venues and producer will approach to direct shows. The director can then cast who they want in it, and also put together their creative team. And obviously, Phil and I will always work together if we can. A lot of these things just sort of happen in conversation and then suddenly turn into a job. We took it on, and it was over a year's work, and was sort of certainly still the biggest scale job I've done, and probably the longest in terms of sort of production timeline as well. And it was immense. We built this enormous sort of installation within York Minster, which is like one of the largest Gothic cathedrals in Europe, I think. And we basically installed this in an enormous kind of raked, stepped stage. It was we installed 1,000-seat audience, so it was like sort of Wembley, really. Yeah, it was big images. You had sort of big auditorium, with 1,000 people in it, and this huge sort of stage that stepped up to the altar, 15 meters high or something, like on 3 tiers, with a raised sort of floor stage level, and all of that was to be able to see the cast. There was like 200 community cast members were in it, and there was only one professional actor who played Jesus.
It just looks incredible. It's just, yeah. People need to look at your website and have a look at the images. Really interesting. When you work somewhere like Tokyo, which sounded like an amazing experience as well, which I'd love to hear about, at Theatre Cocoon, how do the logistics work when you're based in the UK but doing something in Japan?
The Japan stuff has been a real highlight, personally and professionally. I mean, I love going out there. It's an incredible country, just with just an incredible sort of history and cultural heritage, and food, and really lovely sort of people and collaborators I've worked with, and friends I've made now over the years. And it's just been a real highlight. But also, it's kind of been interesting because it's you're always looking for sort of additional ways to kind of keep challenging your work. So like I've really enjoyed the sort of cultural exchange and the sort of cultural challenge of what my work sort of is and reads as in a Japanese context, how an audience reads it. So considering what what visual signifiers might mean to you in a Western audience versus what they might mean to a Japanese audience with a totally different sort of set of cultural signifiers. The communication game is just totally different in Japan. Like, you're working through a translator. So the general setup is that there's me and Phil, director and designer, with usually Ruth has been associate designer on it. And then we also work with, for a number of them, Paddy, who is a composer, British composer. So what's quite helpful is that the design process is still fairly safe ground. Phil and I have done many shows together. We can design it in London, where I'm based. We can design it in the UK as we would any show. And generally, what I'm doing is I'm delivering sort of design deliverables like concept, white card, and final. I'm sort of doing remotely. So we have a lot of Zoom meetings with Japan, and there's usually a big group of people on the other end of the call, and one of them would be my allocated translator, and make sure that what we're delivering can be converted into sort of standard practice for the Japanese and Japanese builders, and because they may expect plans in a slightly different way to that we deliver them, and so there's always a slight sort of process of just manipulating some of that stuff so that everyone's kind of happy. A week before rehearsals tend to all fly out together or close enough together with the physical model box packed up into boxes into our luggage, and we go out there, and Phil will stay out there for the entire time. So he'll be out there for 5 or 6 weeks rehearsals, and then a tech week and a few sort of a dress and a preview. So they're out there for, and Ruth also does the full stint. So they're out there for often over 2 months. it's quite a high caliber of sort of performer in those shows, and the resources are really good, and they want a really good product, and you're really well supported. They really value you being there. They love the exchange. If you open yourself up to they're just such a generous sort of community, and they really want to sort of look after your experience as well. So we were always looked after when we're out there.
It does sound amazing. It's one place that I am desperate to go to, so I could listen to you talk about it for ages. But I did want to ask you about Ulster American, which I came to see recently and loved. It was amazing with Woody Harrelson, Andy Serkis, and Louisa Harland. And you had framed the stage with a light, and it was really intriguing. And then once I got into the story, the set started to make sense of the owner, the character in the play. So what was the intention and process on that play?
So I guess I've done, quite a lot of like hyper real or high realism sort of designs, as well as a lot of sort of more expressive designs and sculptural designs, actually. And sometimes I quite like to find the sweet spot sort of between the two. If something presents itself as a play as quite naturalistic, I'm always looking for a way of just nudging that into something that's maybe a bit more theatrical, one way or another. That's not often always possible, but like you're always looking for a slight sort of, visual angle, I think. And that could be form, architectural form, that can be, use of color, can be use of sort of technical support effects. In this instance, sort of, LED, this sort of LED strip light frame. And, I'm not wanting to, I'm trying to avoid, in a play like Ulster American, presenting something that feels a bit too trad, on arrival. Something that's kind of got a really nice, sharp sort of aesthetic, a nice sort of sharp architectural kind of composition. So we did this sort of very nice, and the venue helped a bit there because it was quite wide. So we sort of played into that and did this sort of almost cinematic wide shot. We sliced a Victorian house down its length. So, and it's a sort of a proportion we're all very familiar with. It's that, like, if you imagine like a Victorian terrace and you've got like the front room, and then you've got like a knocked through to the back room, which is often a dining room, and then you've got the hallway that runs down the whole thing with the stairs upstairs, and then often there's a kitchen out of view at the back of the building. And these are the sorts of places like in Bristol that I grew up in, actually. So I was quite familiar. They felt like a very sort of recognizable property with all the quirks that come with those. Often when people knock through that partition wall, you're just left with two doors. The door into the living room and then the door into the dining room. And that's quite weird, but is super common. And you're then you can see through into the hallway. You've got a view through the bay window out to the front of the street, and you've got a view out the back to the garden, the terrace garden, and all of that, and all the often Victorian kind of period detailing that come with that, like the alcove and coving and roses and ceiling roses and all of that sort of stuff, panel doors. So there's a lot of, it's quite a rich sort of texture to kind of get into in terms of that sort of period property. So ways in which you can crop a space in theatre are really interesting. It's a fixed point camera all the time. The audience isn't going anywhere. Then you've got to do that with the set, or you've got to do it with the support of lighting, to sort of draw the eye. You've got a real big stake in the overall sort of composition of the image, and the choice of image that the audience get to see, and the direction the performers get to sort of play in. And I think this wide shot that we put in for Ulster American was really lovely because it gave them some really sort of strong, for the three of them, some really strong angles to play. And it's a play that sort of gets very agitated, and they all fall out. And I can't really say too much about it because I don't sort of want to ruin the ending potentially for people who may or may not see it. But like it descends into kind of a sort of a a Tarantino-esque style sort of sequence at the end where they all fall out basically in big style. So you start in what feels like quite a safe space, a sort of a very sort of middle class, kind of educated, cultured, sort of safe space, and it descends into this sort of war zone basically towards the end.
That's exactly what I felt. You walk in, you sit down, you think, "Oh, this all looks very kind of normal and sort of interior designy," and then it was clever because you kind of like after, half an hour, you start going, "Ooh," and started to feel quite uncomfortable.
it's in the spirit of contemporary comedy, like, think of The Office and all of that sort of stuff. When that sort of the style of contemporary comedy started to get into that sort of like an everyday realism where weird things sort of happen. And I like that, those sort of the dark comedy stuff. I guess the first layer of it was kind of thinking about whose house it was. So it's obviously the director's house. So Andy Serkis's character, and Andy and I had a few conversations about who did he feel like his character was, what sort, because Andy directs in real life as well. Like he's a performer and a director, and obviously knows loads of directors, and obviously it's a very the play. The three characters are a director, a writer, and an actor. So it's a very like in shop sort of content. So obviously Jeremy, the director of it for real, has got a stake in it because he is obviously a director. Andy is also a director. Andy wanted it to feel like there was a level of sort of clutter in it, and sort of productions from the past and things acquired on journeys around the world or whatever, and storytelling through set dressing. There was a big strong theme of they discuss a play about Northern Ireland and about the notion of Britishness. And there, we had a lot of books around sort of Irish history dotted around. Tried to sort of do a color palette a bit as well, like sort of blends to an extent, because what you want to try and do is the cast to stick out as much as possible. You want your eye needs to follow them. So I will often consider a sort of a design palette that's just maybe a little bit tone off or a tone down in terms of vibrancy from what their looks are, so that you're always sort of picking them out principally. The other thing is I didn't want it to feel too masculine a space. So like I didn't want to go like cool greys and stuff particularly. So I sort of kept it on the warmer tones, and we looked at sort of Farrow and Ball colours, and there was quite a nice sort of terracotta pink in the living room, and sort of then a kind of a grey in the sort of slightly warmer grey in the dining room, and greens in the hall. And it explores misogynism quite a bit and power in the play. The end outcome is that in a way you don't really know who to hate. The three characters need to sort of remain fairly balanced in terms of how as an audience you view or feel about them. And what I didn't want to do with the space is to make it too cold or hard a space, or too like, inverted commas, masculine a space, because you need to like the director character. You need to feel trust in them and in their space.
The psychology is just really clever because, it's all going on in the background.
There are some very big key requirements that the play has to facilitate that you have to have figured out right from the start. So every conversation we had about the layout of the space and texture and color and choices of furniture and artwork, all of that had to then go through the filter of how does that behave in the final scene. And there's a big operation to then reset the show after the show finishes for the performance the following day. And all of that stuff, these aren't one-offs. They've got to last like a two-month run. If something is broken every night, it's got to go back together or replaced, or and if something gets dirty, it's got to be wiped off without leaving any sort of trace. If something collapses, it's got to be designed to collapse repeatedly, night on night on night, for like 2 months. But then going back to the bit that you asked the question about, which was like the light around the frame, I guess that's that was another thing for, I wanted to allude to the piece being like a little bit anarchic, maybe like a whiff of something anarchic, so it was I guess a sort of an aesthetic taste for it to not, you not to walk in and not feel too trad, but like to come in and sort of get a sense of an event is maybe about to take place, and that punchy sort of neon yellow LED light frame, which switched off for the entire show. So it was just for the preset in the end, just gives it a little bit of punch and a little bit of lift, sort of to help sort of an audience build a bit of anticipation and buzz.
It was just brilliant. I'd really like to ask you some advice, if that's okay, for anyone listening who might want to get into the industry, or say is at university or something like that, because it is a tough industry. There's no point denying. I'm not going to sugarcoat it to get into and stay in. What advice would you give to build a sort of sustainable career in the theatre world in your area?
It is hard, and I'm very torn about it, about my love of my profession and also the sort of state of the industry at the moment in terms of how it supports my profession. you've got to be passionate about the craft. I mean, it's just it's very competitive. It's very much like an endurance sport, you know. It's not a job you're going to sort of breeze into, and you're going to be up against a lot of people who are very passionate about theatre, who are very front-footed about networking. They'll know who's who. There's quite a high grade of competition, and I think you need to be aware that I think colleges, by and large, are pumping out far more, design graduates than are jobs available. So just know it's what you want to do and go for it. But do know it's what you want to do. And with that, I think it's a life choice. As well, I think no one really talks about that. Maybe it is a job, but it's a job that will define you. The hours are mad. The erratic sort of nature of employment is pretty wild. You will travel a lot. My profession is freelance, so I work all across the country. How you live your life will be defined by those sort of work patterns. You're going to live quite a non-conventional life. Think on it initially, like you're not going to walk out and just start designing and making money. That is not happening. And anyone who tells you that is just lying. You would need to sort of think about initially theatre design almost as like a sort of portfolio profession. Think about two parallel things. Like one, like trying to be a theatre designer and holding on to that sort of possibility and dream, and two, how do I pay my bills? What might your side hustle be at the same time? Are there other things you can sort of also do that can sustain you whilst you continue to sort of scratch the sort of design itch, and that could be obviously stuff within theatre still. It could be assistant design stuff, associate design stuff. It could possibly, you could jump into maybe TV and film a bit, as I have done. I've done a lot of standby costume for film and fittings and sort of costume dailies. That's one of the things that's really bailed me out over the years in terms of just sort of staying financially afloat to be able to keep doing my own design work.
So what have you got coming up next then? Obviously, you've been working very hard recently, but have you got more planned?
So I'm going to do the designs for an adaptation of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which is a John le Carré novel. And that's going to be with Jeremy, who directed Ulster American. So I imagine we'll start work on that soon, which is good. So I'm looking forward to that. That's a great novel and will be, I think, a really cool stage show. So that's the first thing in hand. Going to go to Japan again, hopefully next year. So I think we're going to do King Lear with a female King Lear, which will be cool. So I'll be starting to have conversations with Phil about that soon. So I'm really looking forward to getting back out there because it's been probably 2 years now since the last time. I've been quite involved over the last couple of years with sort of union work, like in Equity, who is the sort of one of the main unions for theatre, and they support designers as well. And I'm sort of trying to develop with them better terms and conditions for designers, and I've been sort of doing that the last couple of years. So that's a bit of advocacy that sort of takes up quite a bit of time as well, and I would implore any, young early career designer just to sort of touch base with union activity around design as well, just to make sure they're being pointed in the direction of sort of good contracts and all of that sort of stuff.
Clearly your passion.
Very much so. Yeah, very much so.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me. I'm fascinated by your job, and it's been really enlightening. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing some more of your shows soon.
Thanks ever so much.
Thanks for listening. Please do subscribe for more of my chats, and please give me a 5-star rating, as it all helps get the podcast out there. I'll love you forever. If you'd like to learn more about Max's work and see all of the amazing productions he's been working on, then he is at maxjonesdesign.com, and his Instagram is at maxjonesdesign. My website, as ever, is Lucy Gleeson Interiors, and my website is www.lucylovesyit.com, and you can find my Instagram at Lucy Gleeson Interiors. As I say, more to come soon, so keep an eye out, and in the meantime, have a good one.